So yeah, welcome. As people come in, I will hope to let them in. In any case, we have talked about the balance test many times, and I've had a previous presentation that there are about 10 types of outcomes that we are seeing, and we've done 1.8 million now. And that is a lot of tests, and they're published. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what is tested and how this relates to other labs. So basically, you should go to my website, omega3health.us, and there's a lot of information there. You can definitely see how everything is built up in the table of contents. And we have all the publications on the diseases left and topics. That is definitely overwhelming in the beginning, but you can just grind through it and send me questions on the WhatsApp. So, interesting topics like, what really does krill oil do? And is it rancid? And what about the other fats? So, yeah, we are talking about or omega-3 tests today, but we have 3 other tests available. So take advantage of this, $37 vitamin D test. Who does that? That is a very, very low price. Doctors don't want to test for it. You have to specifically ask for them. Insurances typically don't pay for it. So it's a very good way of doing this. Then we have our new gut test, and there's many different talks on that already, but not today. So what's most important about testing is that the second one counts. So everybody's just testing, 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 but so what? Uh, you want to see an improvement, right? So there's not many tests that you actually see an improvement. Once this tests improve, you can actually correlate all other blood work with it. And that's not really topic today, but the improvement of especially the lipid panel and especially triglycerides and other inflammatory markers that are tested and should be tested are definitely following this omega-3 test. It is at the top of the pyramid. So anybody can improve, depends on where you start from. So you cannot necessarily expect to get balanced below 2 to 1 when you only have 1.3% omega-3 to start with. But even at this age, you can easily quadruple your omega-3 in a very short time. And that's what this test shows, from 1.3% to 5.3. And that is still very, very low. Your EPA in this test will be much too low still. So this still needs work. Basically, everybody is in this stage where their inflammatory gauge is up to full volume, and you are in the red, 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 and you are basically in a situation where your immune system is chronically ill. Chronification of inflammation, we call that now. Only when you get below 2 to 1 in your inflammatory index, your immune system can properly work. And that's what we're doing. But this is a great representation. So being in a mid-range of 7 to 1 does not help you. I've presented this many times. There's an exponential increase in all diseases above 7 to 1 inflammatory index. So just below 5 to 1, 4 to 1, you are starting to heal. So our testing is independent, and there's an independent declaration here from Vitas, and that's the reason I put this together today, because somebody just sent me another test from another lab and saying that we are cheating. No, we're not cheating. Zeno has no interest in Vitas labs. They're completely independent. You can take any test you want, and I hope that I will get more tests coming up here very soon that will actually show that our values are simultaneously the same. And this test is very easy to do. You can do it on your own. It's meant to be a home test. And that's why Zenzino is selling it together with their oil. So what is actually tested? It is very, very crucial to understand that you have to test red blood cells because omega-3 lives in the membrane. It's not a liquid molecule, it's a fat, and its function is inside the cell membrane. Inside the cell membrane, it does its job, keeps everything happy, the membrane fluid, the proteins don't work, your mitochondria don't work because the cytochrome C doesn't work. And so that's where it lives and it has to get there. So you can do any test you want. For example, this one here, standard process, as long as it says it's tested in red blood cell membranes. Okay. Just whole blood does not work. It depends on what you ate yesterday or the last week. They have to specifically say they're testing the red blood cell membranes. And when you do that, you get a very, very clean picture here. So these are just peaks running through a column, and the intensity of them tells you relative to a standard how much is present of each of the fatty acids. And these are extremely sensitive tests. So these numbers here just relate to the length and then to the number of double bonds and where they are. So obviously our EPA is in this range here. Up here it's not labeled. They're very long fatty acids and they have a lot of double bonds. And DHA has 6 double bonds up here. So it is a very, very hard molecule to measure, but the sensitivity is clearly there. So these membranes get fixed to this paper. The paper is basically specifically treated. And once they're fixed on there, it's extremely stable and you can send it around for weeks in a dry pouch, properly stored. And the tests are proven to be very, very standardized and very valuable. So you are not in a good situation when you test between 2 to 10 weeks of taking balance oil. So you need to start right away because you're going to get mixed results because your red blood cells haven't fully turned over. And that's what I'm talking about today. So make sure everybody gets tested in the first 2 weeks. After that, the test is not that meaningful. It can be really skewed. But by all means, it's still information. The real test takes then up to 6 months, and I'll explain here why that is. So when you are testing blood, you are looking at the red blood cells isolated. So you can send in your whole blood with Quest or another big lab, and they will separate out the blood cells and then test for omega-3 in here. And you should discard the plasma because that's where a lot of information is that we do not need. And the big deal about this whole red blood cell issue is that basically it takes them a long, long time to turn over in the body. So their lifespan is up to 120 days, half a year, and it takes a good 4 months to exchange all of your red blood cells. Only 1% per day are exchanged. It's actually quite surprising how long they circulate in your blood, right? So that's also why it takes a while to adjust to high altitude or to basically improve your athletic performance. Ultimately, these RBCs are made in bone marrow. Your bone marrow has to be healthy in order to incorporate omega-3 properly and then finally show up in the RBC. So this whole process takes time and it takes stem cells, so-called hematopoietic stem cells. These are special stem cells in your bone marrow. Then they will finally differentiate into either red blood cells or white blood cells, and your immune system depends on them. So the health of these stem cells in the bone marrow is really what counts in the end. That process will be faster and faster as you incorporate 8 to 10% omega-3. So this is kind of like the timing of the whole process. You eat omega-3 that's not rancid in the form of balance oil, and you improve your digestion so you can actually absorb it. And I have long talks on how difficult it is actually to absorb omega-3 into your actual micelles. Fat and water do not mix. So that's why that process inside the body is quite complicated. And that's why we make bile. And a lot of stuff has to happen that omega-3 then floats through your lymph system and finally gets distributed throughout the body's organs. But that takes time. So as I said, bone marrow needs to absorb that omega-3 before it actually makes new healthy red blood cells. And that process, as I said, is about 4 months. And then you can start really thinking about remodeling your entire body. That is a very slow process, may take even more than 3 years. After you remodeled your organs and you have healthy omega-3 organs, talking about the heart or the kidney, then your body generates feedback signals completely different, and your immune system is no longer chronically inflamed. And that is basically your long-term clinical outcome goal. So once again, don't test between 2 to 12 weeks after starting. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for this purpose. But if you have such a test, send it to me and I will put it in perspective. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to test and save that test for the 6 months mark. It is very, very crucial to have that first baseline test, but if you don't have it, you will still see the second one improved. So when your red blood cells turn over, that doesn't necessarily mean it takes instant form in your body. Like I said, some organs take years. Your heart turns over very few percent a year. Your nerves take years. That is all a very slow process. So even though your test improves within a few months, that does not mean that your organs actually will turn over. We're going to do a very interesting study on fat tissue together with Vitas Labs here soon, and basically measure omega-3 in the fat adipose tissue. So ultimately, you really would need a biopsy of each of these organs to tell at what stage you are at. But you can assume that after a very recent time of taking omega-3, you can be assuming that your omega-3 gets incorporated into your body. So give yourself time and realize that red blood cells do take time to turn over and does require healthy bone marrow. So that is all a very interesting process that gets sometimes sped up by the body because even existing cells can incorporate new fatty acids, even though they are living already for a while. And that's probably speeding up this process of making your organs healthy. So there's these three enzymes that actually mix and match fatty acids in the membrane, floppase, and scramblase. They actually live in the membrane, and in this case, they just flip the fatty acids around. So you have a bilayer, right? So you have an outer layer and an inner layer, and then you double it up most of the time, like in mitochondria. But each of these layers basically can be mixed and matched. So the flippase just moves, in this case, in omega-3 from the inside to the outside, or vice versa. Then you can definitely even flip the whole thing over, and you can scramble everything so you can have a more balanced approach depending on your tissue type. So, for example, mitochondria require very high omega-3 on their inner cell membrane and more saturated fat on the outer, and that gives it the curvature. I don't have that picture here, but I've shown it many times. So that's why we have these membrane enzymes that can remodel our membranes continuously, but you need to have omega-3 present, and you need to have omega-3 in your lymph system to be able to get this job done. So there are three phases for this turnover. Like I said, you have to have healthy bone marrow, and that takes a little while. Bone marrow does turn over relatively quickly in a month or two, but the stem cells inside that bone marrow need to double and double. And then those hematopoietic stem cells incorporate omega-3, and then they basically turn into healthy RBCs. So for the persons who just joined, this takes 6 months, and this process is definitely necessary to understand that this is not instant. So then, after that whole process happened, and your immune system as well is turned over through the bone marrow, then you can basically assume that your peripheral tissue is also remodeling with the help of those enzymes that I just mentioned. And of course, the entire lipid profile and how those lipids are shuttled around in the so-called lipids uh, vesicles like LDL and HDL. And I'm not going to get into cholesterol today. That has nothing to do with health altogether, a separate topic. But the liver plays an integral role into this. And also, when you start having omega-3 in your diet, of course, your beta oxidation, meaning that you will actually use omega-3 and turn on your mitochondria to actually really burn down your fat instead of making more and more of it. So omega-3 as a weight loss tool in that sense. Then the third step, phase 3, like I said, takes years as a summary here, and you will slowly actually deplete your adipose tissue that is necessary in order to really balance out your entire saturated fat. The adipose tissue contains mostly omega-9, actually. That's just because it's liquid, it has to be. Saturated fat is solid, and it is a good energy source, and your body makes it. So your liver makes omega-9 in order to store that energy you get from all of the carbohydrates. And that's why you get fatter and fatter in your abdomen. But once you have omega-3, you have a completely different beta oxidation, and everything plays together, and the brain can incorporate that DHA better. It has a different mechanism. I talked about that on another talk. Bottom line is it's all about chronic inflammation, your dial turning from very red to green, as I showed in the beginning. And that is our long-term goal with Balance Oil, and that's our observation. testing over years. So almost 1.8 million tests performed. What do they actually show? I talk about this all the time. You need to look at the numbers. Just looking at the index doesn't mean that much, and that's partly where the confusion comes in today. Looking at other lab tests, you need to look at the absolute number of the EPA. That's pretty much the only thing that matters. So when you have 0.41% EPA of the required 4%, that is a 90% efficiency. And that's where our problem comes from. You put that on top of a 12, 13, even 15% arachidonic acid, and that gets you to a 30 to 1 inflammatory index. So we have a situation now where nobody, absolutely nobody, even tests at 1% EPA anymore. And that's not how it used to be. I grew up on a 1, 2, 3%, even depending on how much fish I ate. And we are bombarded with inflammatory arachidonic acid. Even traditional fishing countries like Norway and Japan are over 10 to 1. And that's why Zenzino made this effort, even though they live in probably the best testing country after Japan in this world. So yeah, we are talking about a 90% deficiency. This is the value that matters. And if you don't look at anything else, that's what you need to look at. So even a diabetic that is actually injecting insulin can get balanced in 7 months. So it doesn't necessarily relate that you are in a chronic illness, and you can improve your test to a very, very low level and look at the exact numbers. How much EPA did this person really incorporate in that time? Did it quadruple it, or 5 times more, or 6 times more? And then you understand your own testing process. So here in this case, we went from a 42% efficiency. This is not the first test, obviously, to being balanced. Just to get to 2% EPA is a miracle for most people now. So now we finally get to the point here of my talk, is what happens when other people test, right? There are many, many tests out there, even rancid oils, which names I won't mention, offer tests on their website that nobody is using, obviously. We sell the test together so we can prove to you that our oil is not rancid. And so when you send people to another lab, Quest around here is a very, very prominent lab, their values completely correlate with ours. Unfortunately, I only have 3 tests at my hand here right now. I have another one, and this needs definitely more data, but the mechanism of testing is the same in all labs, as long as I've shown you like the standard labs are testing the red blood cell membrane component. But what is different is their output. So when Quest shows a 4 to 1 omega-3 ratio, I get this message back that Zenzino is a scam because people tested at 13 to 1. I'll show you in a second. But this output is literally, there's so much wrong with this. I could probably talk a half an hour just about this picture, but what does that mean here? Less than 3 is below range. The better your range, the more healthy you are. And certainly 14.4, as I've shown you in other studies, is far above the 8 to 1 inflection points where everything turns exponential. So putting 3.7 in range, okay, but 14, no. And why is it red below 3.7? I'll tell you why it's red, because they don't ever see anybody there, so they have to do it that way. So if you look at the real numbers from this test, you are finally discovering what's behind this whole thing. And the actual ratio that was shown here, and this is the output to the patient, right? It's a nice little traffic light output, completely wrong, gross misrepresentation. They just divide the entire omega-6 and the entire omega-3 population, which is totally meaningless because we know that omega-6 linoleic acid is at 20%, and the alpha linoleic acid is also in a high value, but they have zero metabolic results. They're just precursors. They do not get incorporated into the membrane. They are just precursors, and they're basically in a state where you have a very, very misrepresentation of what's going on. So just dividing entire 6 over entire 3 is not meaningful because the immune system only responds to EPA and arachidonic acid, and that is the real ratio here. And that is 9.6, not 4.2. So this output to the patient should clearly show 9.6 and not 4.2. And when you look at the absolute EPA amount, and this is a person who has been taking omega-3 on and off for a while. This test's not exactly correlating. This was a test from last year from that same person. And now you can see how their EPA increased from 1.1 to 1.6 by taking the oil very infrequently. I know that for a fact. And then you can understand that this test did improve from 13 to 1 down to 9.6 to 1, but it is not 4.2 and it is not a scam. And this test completely correlates with what we are doing. So here's another one from Omega Quant, and you can see that the output here was 0.58. This is again not done at the exact same time. So there was a little bit of an improvement here on our test, but you can see that 0.58 correlates with 0.84. And that's probably within the error margin in a very, very low amount of EPA. And it's not really significant. So if this test here would show 3% EPA and ours would show 0.8%, then I would say, yeah, we have a problem here. But this test completely correlates, and the same for the arachidonic acid as well, which is approximately the same. It actually came down a little bit here. The bottom line is, again, they're putting 0.3%, I think that's where this ends here, into the green. And that is, in my opinion, very criminal. That is a level of omega-3 EPA to regulate your immune system that is in the autoimmunity range. And we never used to test like this. This is a new thing. Putting that into the green. And what does that even mean to the patient? It is not explained, is a very, very gross misrepresentation of what omega-3 should be. And that's the difference between these tests and ours, is that we actually use the real numbers, and the real numbers are not made up. I presented this many times that 8% omega-3 is required to be healthy. This is not a number that we pull out of our sleeve. It is a well-established scientific number, so it makes absolutely no sense. And I do not understand why the FDA allows an output like this to be in the green. So they look at a lot of other stuff often, which is very interesting. So we do not test for everything. There are a lot of other saturated fats that are very interesting, especially our arachic acid, for example, and lots of stuff to talk about if you had all the data together. Um, Trans fats is something I think we should test for indicating, how much processed foods people are eating, but we are trying to stay away from that. So here's another Quest test that I got from somebody, and 0.7% EPA is in range in the green. 1.9% DHA is in the green, and a 6:3 ratio in this case, published correctly, is in the green. Yeah, you tell me why they allow something like this, and our test here clearly correlated again with this. So yeah, I don't have tests exactly side by side. These tests are definitely within range and explainable, and always look at the real progress that we are showing. Always look at the EPA, not just at this number, because even a 3-to-1 index ratio needs to be analyzed correctly, and that's why we put our PDFs files side by side. Yeah, any questions? This was a short one today. No
Not a
questions?
question. No, not a question, but for me it was, thank you so much, Hans Thomas. For me, it was quite interesting to see the phases of regeneration. And we knew, I'm sorry for my English, German. We saw the comparison to other laboratories as well in Germany. And Cincino and Vitas, they work with raw material, raw datas, and not like Referenzwerten, not a bright spectrum. And that was amazing for me to see. Here is the raw data. And what you say, the EPA higher than 3.5. There are some corporations in the omega-3 market. They have the range from 1% to 7% EPA, and in the range in Zinsino is smaller and more precise and higher from 3.5 and not from 1. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I definitely don't think there is a let me put that up. Uh, there is a uh is the range 7% EPA. I think you're meaning 7% overall. So when you add EPA and
And one, if you had, if you should, also, if your result shows, for example, 1.5, it might be okay. I will send you private the slide from our teacher. I will tell you, I will show you the
Mhm,
difference in the analysis systems. I have
mhm.
some trainings I will send you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you should post it on the WhatsApp. It's very interesting.
Yes,
Somebody could get to 7%. I've never even seen anybody at 5%. So basically, that would definitely be the case in somebody overdosing and having almost a negative index.
yes,
So I'm not sure if that's something you want to do. Um, Getting to 4%, 4.5%, I think is very good. And by the way, we had this question last time, when fish is negative, but yet they have a much higher DHA ratio, right? How do we get that much EPA? Question mark, right? And the same process happens in vegan oil. We need to enrich the EPA during the actual process of purification. So this isn't straight up fish. It's a process that is very, very complicated. It's not easy to make fish oil. It's not just straight up fish, just to give you that record. And I heard through the grapevine we're getting a high EPA vegan oil, so I'm very excited about that.
thank you so much.
Sure, yeah. Awesome. I'll see you guys the next time.